In the United States, since the mid-1990s, in some cities at least, there has been a sort of a return to the city, right? There was a big urban crisis in the 60s and 70s that was prompted initially by technology of the automobile, suburbanization. There were racial problems that were unique to the United States. There was an influx of drugs in the 1980s, crack cocaine. The U.S. has more guns than other countries. So when you have drug-related violence, it becomes much more violent. And so you had a real hollowing out of urban centers almost sort of everywhere. Yeah. So suburbanization happens everywhere because it's a technological change. But in the United States, you get a particularly intense form of it, quote unquote, inner city, which is understood to mean a poor area, right, full of sort of underclass people, racial minorities. And that doesn't exist in, say, Paris, right? No matter what happens with suburbanization in France, things like that, central Paris is the best part of Paris, right? So what you've had in the United States since crime started falling in the mid-90s is a return to the classic urban dynamic, which is that living proximate to downtown in a prosperous city is considered a good thing to do once again. And so you've seen lots of sort of changes in different kinds of neighborhoods. Now, you talk about gentrification in specific neighborhoods, specific places, dating back to almost forever is one of the points I want to make. But if you want to talk about big macro trends, right, starting in the 90s, crime falls, you see a return to the city. And I think the most important thing to know about gentrification is that most American cities are not seeing a kind of phenomenon where neighborhoods that used to be poor are becoming affluent. That in Midwestern cities in particular, I think the mayors there and the residents would love to have this quote-unquote issue of fancy people are moving to town and they want weird boutiques. As some people say, when rich people come to town, it actually makes the poor people worse off because it raises the relative price of housing and now they have no money. That's, I would say, the conceptual concern about gentrification is when rich people show up, is that bad? In a city where the supply of housing is very constrained, you do see this immiserating gentrification, right? Where rich people come to town makes the poor people worse off. They're sort of housing incomes fall. And especially San Francisco, where the difficulty of building extends way into the suburbs, right? D.C. is a little bit unusual because we're sort of on the border between Maryland and Virginia has a sort of a southern political economy, so the suburbs keep sprawling out there. But like Boston, New York, San Francisco, the housing supply does not expand, and working class people actually can wind up worse off because the price of housing goes up. Right. And so then what they find is that in looser markets, this doesn't happen, and it's good when rich people move to town, right? So if you're living in San Antonio and some people decide, oh, city living's cool, like let's go move downtown, and then they open up the yoga studios, they open up the coffee shops. That just means more jobs, and it's win-win. That's most of America. But then the other things that you hear a lot about gentrification, not just from, say, working-class minority people, but from young, college-educated white professionals who this is the 18 months after you moved in kind of thing. And one just reality is that people move to neighborhoods often because they like the neighborhood. And then the neighborhood changes, and they just don't like the fact that it changes. So it's hard to think of a policy mechanism that would create the sense of neighborhood stability that I think people psychologically crave. You can address the income immiseration effect by having laxer zoning so people can add more housing more quickly. And that's what you see in the research. But to the extent that what people don't like about gentrification is the change, looser zoning makes it worse. You can handle the income effects by allowing more construction and more investment, but that means that the city changes more rapidly. So there's a real tension between the sort of concern for the poor aspect of gentrification and the I want my city to be a certain way aspect of it.
But the question then is, okay, well, what do you do? Because I think to some degree the anger is that for reasons that are and remain a little bit mysterious, the crime wave dropped.
Right.
And so that kind of kicked off a process of these areas becoming much safer, much more desirable. You had young people begin to move in. There is certainly anecdotally some displacement. So what do you do? What is your amelioration wish list?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few different ways to think about it. And so one case is you have the constrained housing stock, right? Dynamic, right? The city gets richer because more affluent people come in, but it is harmful to some of the poorest residents of the city. So you could address that through redistribution. Right? You could have a tax and transfer scheme to compensate people of different kinds. And there's sort of political problems with that, but you could do it. The other approach is to change the zoning policy. So you have more construction. That turns it into a win-win, right? The studies show in places with lax development rules, when affluent people move in, it economically benefits everybody. But you accelerate the pace of sort of culture shock and weirdness.
Right.
And so my preference is to just lean into that and just say that, you know what? Cities are dynamic, changing places. They are not historical boutique museums, and we need to let them change, let them breathe, let them grow. But when you're thinking on a more sort of concrete level, I would say one thing that people should be more mindful of, where their sort of practical behavior tends to be separate from their political behavior, is thinking about what kinds of amenities they want to see the city government going and investing in. Because part of what sort of unleashes gentrification cascades is that urban economics are all about clusters, right? It's like things are close to each other. And so it depends what you want to be close to and what you care about. And so when you have a city government invest in things that sort of affluent yuppies are likely to care about, like bicycle lanes and dog parks, the tendency is to increase the thing where, rich people are willing to pay a premium for that, but poor people don't experience it as a huge improvement in their actual quality of life. And so it's just a kind of immiserating sort of dynamic. Whereas conversely, if the high schools get better, right, that does make a neighborhood more appealing to certain sets of more affluent people, but it also makes it more appealing to lower income people. And school quality is actually more important to people from low socioeconomic status families for a whole variety of reasons. But so there you may see an increase in costs, but it's proportional to an actual benefit that, is going to be received by people. So, having some thought to that, right? The quality of your bus service, the quality of the high schools, right? The city services.
And on the bus stuff, it often seems that richer people have a lower opinion of buses compared to other kinds of public transportation. Compared to subways, compared to streetcars, compared to light rail systems, compared to all kinds of things that somehow feel more fun to richer people. But buses are really important.
Cities will pretty explicitly say that the reason they are investing money in mixed traffic streetcars that don't run any faster than buses is that they're hoping to, they will say, spark economic development, which is to say they're hoping to create gentrification, which is not crazy if you're talking about a Midwestern city that is lacking in investment and stuff. But if you're talking about Washington, where we've built a streetcar, but also where mayor after mayor says they're concerned about affordable housing, and also they're not changing the zoning, it doesn't add up. And you have to think, why do we want to spend taxpayer dollars to make scarce housing be more occupied by wealthy people if we're saying we're worried that poor people are being squeezed out? The best solution to this really is to build more places for people to live. It works out pretty nicely. But I guess my main bottom line that I want everyone to take away from this is that there is no way to freeze neighborhoods in place and time. And there's particularly no way to freeze neighborhoods but then also make them better, right? Which is like the paradoxical thing that people want. Nobody looks at a neighborhood that is super segregated, overwhelmingly poor, no jobs, no economic opportunity, and says, well, what's awesome about this is that we don't have a gentrification yet, right? You look at those neighborhoods and people recognize, so something has to change, right? The city services have to get better. There has to be more investment. There has to be some businesses. There has to be some jobs. Ideally, you would like to see some mix of races and classes living there. But that means that the neighborhood has to change. And letting the built environment change is the easiest way to make that change be something that's compatible with everybody's interests.